or at least have a basis of the Victoria Conservatory music, which has been part of my life for my whole adult life, and it's been one of the great gifts to me. It happens that we're celebrating our 40th anniversary, our 50th anniversary as an institution. As you can see, just by the color of my beard, I've been around for a while, and the conservatory, as I said, has played a very important role in my life. This may mean that I'll touch on aspects of Victoria's classical music scene and maybe non-classical music scene, because we're all much more interconnected than people think. It could be the opera, or it could be the university, it could be the belfry, or anything like that, the Victoria Symphony. We all have relationships with each other, which are immensely fulfilling and immensely interesting and stimulating and challenging, of course. So my own primary interest, as Colin said, talk about your passion. My own passion circulates mostly around what people will call classical music. And this can mean anything from the opera to the symphony to music that is usually associated with the church, various different denominations, to chamber music, to piano solo music, to song. So it's very, very varied in and of itself. But I grew up in a family that was all very interested in various kinds of music, and I didn't actually begin taking instrumental lessons on the piano until I was already 17, which is quite late to begin. So I always had an interest in various kinds of popular music as well, particularly musicals. If anybody else was alive in the early 60s as a young person, you'll remember that Broadway musicals, we just listened to them. We all knew all the songs, so that's been a very important part of my life as well. And when I was a rebellious 13-year-old, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, and Jimi Hendrix were all still alive. They wouldn't be here for very long. It's only so far I'll go in that direction. But this was a vibrant part of my musical background too. So it's just been a very interesting journey. So the Victoria Conservatory of Music has occupied 4 different buildings in Victoria. And at some point in my long and misspent life, I had lessons in all 4 of them, or at least worked in all 4 of them. And the first one is a tiny building across from the McPherson Playhouse. Even my own memories of it are quite dim now, next to the Centennial Square. But the crowning time of a young person's life as a music student was the years that we spent in Craigdarroch Castle. Now, does anybody in the room remember the conservatory at Craigdarroch Castle? Did anybody take lessons there? Oh, wonderful. That was quite a magical place to go. And that was one of the periods when the city rented a facility to an arts organization, us, the Victoria Conservatory of Music, for $1 a year. And we lived there with a group of people who were more concerned with presenting the castle as a tourist attraction, which is fine, that's exactly what it is. Sometimes the marriage was a bit uneasy, but we managed mostly to get along as well as can be expected. In those days, this was the 1970s, security and the idea of security was much more lax than it is today. So as a young student, I still had a key to the place. I could go in at any time I wanted, and I remember spending a whole New Year's Day practicing there, but the whole building was closed. I will tell you that by 8 o'clock in the morning, you could not get a room. It was filled with serious music students practicing. It was a wonderful environment. But we outgrew it very quickly, and we moved to a building which is no longer in existence. It was the St. Anne's Academy Annex, a building of no intrinsic architectural merit, but it certainly served our purpose for a number of years. And when it became apparent that at least some of the leading members of the city wanted us to have a permanent home, we purchased what was the Metropolitan United Church. By the time even the late 80s, let alone the late 90s rolled around, the United congregation downtown simply could no longer support having 2 churches. Some of you might remember the Metropolitan United Church was 2 blocks away from First United, and there was no real reason for them to have 2 churches anymore. So they sold us it, the Metropolitan United, and it's now the Conservatory of Music with rental facilities that are known as the Alice Goulden Hall. I can say a few words about her later, and the Robin and Winifred Wood recital hall. My 2 teachers, my 2 mentors, people who became my colleagues who are no longer with us. And I remember them with only a little bit less affection than I do my own parents. They were so important to me. And the Metro Theatre. So it's a very vibrant part of our downtown. And we share it with a lot of different people, very happily, actually. So that's where we are now. And I said I'd mention a little bit about the Alex Goulden Hall. On the way out here, my cab driver asked me if that was the correct name of the hall. He'd gone to see something there. I remember Alex Goulden, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because the whole existence of the conservatory and the whole existence of many of our artistic institutions in Victoria has relied so greatly on the time and, yes, the money and funding that has been provided to us from people in the community. And Alex Goulden was one such person. Her passion was founding a music school and using the members of the Victoria Symphony Orchestra as a nucleus of teachers, and founding a music school that could operate at a professional training level, as well as one that could offer lessons to very young children. And yes, how many of you remember about taking lessons in an instrument before as young children? Ah, yes, a lot of you have. Now, not everybody continues to take lessons. The number of times I've had an adult person say to me, "Oh, I wish I'd practiced more. I wish my parents had made me practice." No, you don't. And many of these people will come and take piano lessons again, and within 2 to 3 weeks, 6 at the utmost, they remember exactly why they didn't want their mother to have to practice. But many of the times that did make them enthusiastic listeners to music, enthusiastic audience members, and therefore supporters of one aspect of the cultural community of Victoria. So I said I'd say something about Alex Goulden. Mrs. Goulden was still alive when I was a young student, and a very enthusiastic member of the audience whenever students played. She went to the music festival to hear us, and she went to concerts that were put on by our teachers. She organized special events so that gifted and hardworking young students could have an audience and find a platform. And I remember being at her 80th birthday. It took place in the large room at Craigdarroch Castle, which you can visit now. And sitting beside me was a woman even older than 80, Mrs. Gertrude Huntley Green, who had a very distinguished career as a concert pianist. And she retired here and was a firm supporter of most of the organizations in town. And somebody was playing Happy Birthday for Mrs. Goulden rather slowly. And Mrs. Huntley Green, Mrs. Gertrude Duran was her professional name. She turned to me and said in a stage whisper, which could have been heard throughout all the house, "Don't they want her to have another one?" So now these people are legends. Now their names are on the walls of different houses and places that we now call our artistic homes. And so it is one of the things that I think about if I am tempted at all to think, "Oh my God, I'm getting old." I think, yeah, but I got to meet Mrs. Goulden. I got to meet Mrs. Durant. And so this is part of my background. And I want to address the whole issue of why somebody would dedicate a life to the pursuit of excellence in the field of what we call classical music. We could talk now, or I could talk. I could blather on now for 3 or 4 hours, and I'm not going to do that. Obviously, people have love for many, many kinds of music. Very, very rarely you'll meet somebody who is unmoved by something in the field of music. I've learned that the most important thing is to encourage people to enjoy music, not to impose your own taste on them. Trust me, that was a long lesson to learn. Because when somebody said to me, "You know, my favorite piece, my favorite opera is Phantom of the Opera," I have to not say, "That's not an opera," or not say, "Mozart's better." Say, "Isn't that wonderful? Tell me what you like about it." And encourage me to listen to those tunes as well. And very often somebody will say, "You know, I never really got into classical music." And I have to stop myself from saying, "That's because you didn't give it a chance." Because a number of times that I said, "I'm not really into country music," it's a lot of times. And then I actually gave it a fair listen, and I've got about 9 or 10 favorite country singers now. It's very easy to accumulate different things like that when you actually try them out. So at the conservatory, we offer lessons in all sorts of different types of music and encourage it. One of the things that we have cultivated over the years that I have only a very small part of is an actual jazz department for any of our local jazz artists performing. It's very exciting to have these sorts of things living alongside somebody learning Mozart concertos and Schubert songs.
But I think the most important thing that attracted, well, I will tell you actually a little bit about myself and my own relationship with classical music. I just fell in love with it when I was a young child. I had one of the greatest pieces of luck that any young child could have. We did not have a TV until I was 4. So I had no idea that there was such a thing. And by the time one arrived in the house, I had no interest in it whatsoever because I learned how to operate my dad's record player. How many of you remember 78s? Let's be honest. My dad had 78s as well as 33s. And by the time I was 4, I could drop the needle anywhere. I never, ever got it wrong. So that was much, much more interesting. And his records included classical music, but they also included the Anders sisters, Gracie Fields, Glenn Miller. Those names ring a bell to anybody who does. They don't write them like that anymore. And so it was a very eclectic sort of background in music. But we didn't have an actual piano. So at school I'd go and learn things on the piano. And ultimately I tried guitar and I tried violin, but there was something about the piano as an instrument to play that I wanted to do. So we finally got one when I was 16, and I had the effrontery, the nerve, the audacity to go to the Victoria Conservatory of Music and ask to play for Mrs. Winifred Scott Wood, who was the vice principal. Now, Winifred and Robin, her husband, and the other teachers were known to us. And the reason they were known to us in the community of Victoria is because they used to go from school to school and play concerts for us. This was funded in part by the school board and funded in part by the Musicians Union. These are the things that I would like to bring back to the community, is actual performances of seasoned professional artists for young kids in schools. There is no special effect on the screen yet that equals the sight of somebody making music on an instrument, because special effects so rarely touch the heart and music so rarely doesn't. So in any case, I just sort of thought, well, I've heard Mrs. Wood play, I'm going to go study with her. And she took me, which I don't know that I've ever thanked her enough for that generous gesture. It would be like a sort of little scruffy ragamuffin coming and saying, yes, I'd like to sing next season on the stage of the Met. It isn't quite like that, but that's the way it felt to me. And then my life changed completely. This is what happens when you're involved in the arts, I think, is it becomes an absolute obsession and you become completely single-minded about it. And that is necessary. And so that's what happened to me. December 5th, 1972 was my first lesson. I was 17 years old. December 3rd, 1972, I knew I would be a musician, no matter what it took. And here are some of the things that people said, of course, and they were absolutely right. They said you started way too late to be able to really be adept at playing piano. They said there's so many concert pianists. I didn't really have an ambition to be a concert pianist, just to be a working musician. They said there's no hope. You should really go into something else. And I don't think that that's bad advice, for the simple reason that if one person that you don't even know saying that you shouldn't go into the arts will deter you from going into the arts, you probably don't have what you really need, which is tenaciousness and a long word called stick-to-itiveness. So that's what we all had in those days at the conservatory. Plus, I guess fewer distractions, but it just takes a kind of single-mindedness. So then you look at what do you do with it, and how do you share it with other people? And you find the areas of teaching. Now, it's a kind of truism in music, and it must be in theater too, that the best performers do not always make the best teachers. There's a whole different way of thinking about the practicalities, the mechanics of playing the piano, or of singing. One of my colleagues is here, Maureen Branch, who teaches voice at the conservatory and has for a long time. And actually is one of your neighbors. She actually teaches voice in her home too, right in this area. And we both have looked at the issue of teaching over the years so many times. You reevaluate yourself every day. How can I help any kind of person who comes to me? It is one of the greatest responsibilities that one can have. And it informs your own playing and your own way of listening to music, your own way of thinking about life, really, which is really what being in the arts always does. And it reminds me of a song that I knew by heart when I was 5, Getting to Know You, from the King and I. Remember when she says, by my pupils I am taught. That was absolutely true. I don't know if Rogers and Hammerstein ever taught anyone, but if you learn so much from the actual art of teaching that I don't think that they are mutually necessary to one another. So I mentioned that the symphony, the Victoria Symphony, was meant to provide some of the most important teaching at the conservatory. We have a wonderful city when it comes to music. We have a wonderful city when it comes to culture. How often have we gone away to bigger cities or to ones about the same size, and seeing a relative desert compared to Victoria. One of the few things, actually, when you get to be old, you realize that there really shouldn't be that much that makes you mad. But one of the things that does make me mad is when people say, well, there's nothing to do in Victoria. There's too much to do in Victoria. You can't get to anything resembling everything. And it's a remarkably sort of, I would say codependent, but that has negative connotations. We rely on one another. We send each other audience members. We recommend things to each other, and we feed each other. And so the symphony was really an important part of the very beginning of the conservatory because their players taught there. And even their conductor taught there. He was one of the old school Europeans. He brought this sort of aspect of culture to Victoria. Now, many years later, a good friend of mine who studied at the conservatory himself and who was associated with Mr. Timothy Vernon, does that name ring a bell? He started an opera company here, which is the most unlikely thing to do. So we had a symphony, and who ever heard of a symphony on an island in basically in the middle of nowhere next to Vancouver, where that's where they're supposed to have these things. Then we started a conservatory of music, which is also unlikely, and now an opera company. All of these things shouldn't happen. They shouldn't be in Victoria. And yet not only are they in Victoria, they are known throughout our actual country. And so Timothy began an opera company, which is very well known. And again, we sort of we coexist in a sense of mutual cooperation. So as I've said when I began, the conservatory is now going to be 50 years old this year, and we're having celebrations. The symphony has instituted one of the most attractive tourist spectacles that occurs every year, the Symphony Splash. This is known and admired throughout the whole continent. It also continues to put on concerts that are more wonderful than ever. We have the opera company, which is praised every year by the Canada Council as being the most innovative in every way that we have in our country. So I think we're doing pretty well. Now I want to take a few minutes and address something that I always find is the elephant in the room, because I've talked about classical music and jazz. Jazz is not what I would call an aspect of popular music. If we look at the statistics for sales of CDs, which no longer are such an important sort of part of musical revenue, if we look at them, jazz accounts for not that much more than classical, and it's very low, at 2.5% or 2.7%. So jazz is in and of itself a kind of music with a small but very loyal audience. And when I talk about that, and when I talk about my love for classical music, my feeling that it's important, it's helpful for people to at least be exposed to Mozart and Handel, and to Schumann and Beethoven and to Brahms and Bartok, and to the 20th century composers that people still find even alienating. I'm often asked if I realize that I'm being somewhat elitist. Now, does this term come up in anybody's conversation? Now, this is a difficult charge because it can mean so many different things. So I'm going to tell you a little anecdote. This was an actual result of a process of research. Am I elitist, or are we elitist? The usual sort of leveler between the haves and the have-nots is, of course, money. And usually money is at the root of that question. Are we aware we're providing something that can only be afforded by the very wealthy? So I had a look at the symphonies and opera companies. This is back in 1999-2000. I wanted to see how many other ones offer outreach programs that educate young people in the art, that invite them to come to dress rehearsals for a greatly reduced ticket price, and that offer ticket prices like Joel described at the Belfry and that we have at the Symphony. Every single opera company in North America did. There was not one exception. Every single professional company offered tickets to members of the community that A, couldn't afford them, or younger ones who were not ready really to be able to buy tickets at that price that could go to dress rehearsals. And I remember myself going to a very fine production of a new opera that was based on Arthur Miller's play Up Here from the Bridge. And I paid $16 for that ticket, and it was at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City. It was standing room, and boy, is that ever comfortable there. You had your own little surgeon panel and everything. I had the best view of the stage that I ever had at the Met. I don't really like going to the Met very much. And here I was, $16. Now, only a couple of years earlier than that, I'd gone to a concert at GM Place in Vancouver. And this featured Van Morrison, Joni Mitchell, a That's why I mentioned it. And the poet of the people himself, Bob Dylan. Now, the lowest ticket price for that was $85, and you can bet you paid $85 or you didn't get anywhere near the door. There were no prices for the unemployed. There were no prices for students. No one got invited to go to the sound check for $10. You paid your money to get into that. So I did have to ask, what's elitist then? And then I said, but you expect people to spend so much time and effort learning how to play instruments and learning how to do things. And I thought, well, I would quote to you something which is from an American opera singer named Beverly Sills. Does that name really? I loved her. And she said one of the best things, which is there's no shortcut to anywhere worth going. So yes, it is a time-consuming process learning how to master an instrument. And it's also a time-consuming process learning how to be Derek Jeter or Frank Cavanato, or any of those people. It takes the same kind of single-mindedness to excel at athletics. And I also thought to myself, I bet Eric Clapton spent a lot of time learning how to play as well. It just is one of those things to excel at anything is a real process. It takes a single-mindedness, as I said, and a deep commitment, and a willingness not to try to do a whole pile of other things. So that is one of the ways in which I've thought about the whole role that elitism plays. To me, the arts are available to everybody. Usually there's some way you can find your way to the arts. It is possible, of course, to get to know Jane Austen and Charles Dickens in Tulsa for nothing, because they go to the library. But it does take a certain amount of commitment, and you have to bring something to the concert or to the book or to the performance. You have to be able to bring something of yourself in terms of your time, in terms of your willingness to pay attention. Sometimes in terms of your willingness to talk about it and think about it afterwards. Let yourself, okay, I think that was a life-changing experience. You had one at the theater. I had one the other day at the symphony. One of my favorite pieces was played. A piece that I played by myself in the follies of my youth, the Brahms' first piano concerto. And it was a friend that was playing it, John Cabrera Parker, who had his days at the conservatory too. And the performance was overwhelming. It was one of those experiences that causes you to rock 3 blocks in the wrong direction. It was very moving. It took me a long time to really get over it. But it was worth it. It was worth all those years I spent getting to know that piece. That this was one of those times when for 40 minutes Brahms spoke to me. I think that's a great privilege. And that privilege is available to anybody who wants it. So that's what I wanted to say about the conservatory. I'm very proud of my association, but not because of anything I've done, because of all the gifts I've been given. And if I have time left to give some of those gifts back to my students, I'll be grateful for a circular sort of approach to the whole idea of a life in the arts. So that's what I wanted to say to you. And also to invite you to keep your eye open on what's going on with the 50th anniversary of the conservatory. There'll be concerts, there'll be events, and you'll be able to come on down to the 900 Johnson Street and visit the Albert School Hall and see what we're all up to. And on that note, not